The California Colloquium on Water lecture series, and tonight we have Diana Jacobs from, well, she's retired, but first I'd like to make a few announcements. My name is Linda Vita, and I'm the director of the Water Resources Center, and we're the major sponsor of the Colloquium, and my staff and I handle all of the logistics for this series. First, I'd like to ask if there are people here who have never attended a colloquium before. If you could raise your hand. Okay. So we have, I laugh because Andrew Chang, who's the director of the Water Center at Riverside, is here, and he's my boss. So he's here for the first time to see one of the lecture series. So we do have an email reminder sheet in the back, and so if you'd like to get a reminder via email of the lectures 1 week prior, please put your name, sign up, and put your email on the reminder list. I also would like to call your attention to our 2007 calendar, which has just been published, and it's Mountains to Mouths, Development of the San Francisco Bay Area's Water Supply. So I'm not sure how many of you know, but each year the Transportation Library and the Water Archives for the past 8 years have published a calendar that has a historical water and transportation theme. And this year the calendar was underwritten by the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, East Bay Mud, Metcalf and Eddy, Kennedy Jenks, and URS Corporation. And we do have them for sale. So we have brochures in the back, and I can send one of these around if you'd like to look at the photos. We also have some other materials about the archives somewhere in the back, so feel free to pick some of that up. And at this point, I would like to introduce Tim Ramirez, who is the chair of the Water Resources Center Advisory Board, and he will introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I'm sure that was for Linda, not for me. I could very easily read Diana's state employee biography and just tell you she worked there for 25 years and worked for DWR and worked for the State Lands Commission and worked for Fish and Game, and then let her talk. But that'd be far too easy and not enough background for you guys to have about her. I won't take too much time, but I wanted to say just a couple things about her just to give you some context so that you appreciate some of the things that you're going to hear today. She's one of the few people, I think, who actually can navigate all the different vocabularies you need to actually get things done in government, whether it's the biology, the laws, the budget and personnel arena of working for the government, or the biology of fish, or the biology of rivers. She's the one person I know who can speak all of those languages. And it's quite odd to have somebody who's able to talk about the Latin names of plant species at the same time she can talk about how to hire somebody at the same time as she can talk about how rivers actually function, which is, I think, by and large, what made her very successful in her career with the state. You won't see this in the bio, I don't think, that was on the website, but just to touch on a couple of things that she's been involved with during her career. I think most folks are familiar with the Mono Lake proceedings and hearings. She was one of the expert witnesses that testified in that proceeding. She was very involved in the issue of frogs in the High Sierra and stocking of the lakes by her department at the time, which went over really big with her colleagues at the department. She was involved with Lake Davis and the pike issue in Northern California. She, as you can see, didn't shy away from anything at all that was controversial. In fact, she lived for those things. She also worked on the California Rivers Report, which I'm sure is in the archives someplace, the 1993 document, which if most folks do any work on rivers in California, it's the one thing you actually go and find that is helpful and has references to all the other work done before that. It's a great source for people who want to know about California rivers. She was also involved in helping spend, I don't know how much money, over a gazillion dollars from the bonds passed by the state of California voters, Prop 204, 12, 13, 40, 50. In some way, shape, or form, she had her hand in a lot of those issues and probably directed the majority of it to the Sacramento River, which is fine. It's the state's biggest river, and it's not as great as the Tuolumne, which is the one that I care about still, but we always did battle about whether it was the Tuolumne or the Sacramento that deserved the most attention. Her title at the department was Science Advisor. I don't think they ever had one before. I suspect they won't have one again. She had a very unique she had a very unique role with the directors, the one that she worked with most recently and the one before that, Bob Height. And she was often also one of the only women in the department at that level of government. And except when the Secretary for Resources was a woman, of course, who I worked for. But Diana often stood alone, not just in terms of the issues, but her perspective and her tireless advocacy for science and for people to do the right thing. And when I was on campus here, I know that a lot of folks talked about trying to work in careers to help advance policy and have science inform policy and do the right thing and provide the best information for people. And when I met Diana at the state, she was the one person actually doing it. And it's a really hard job. And she did it very well and for a very long time, and always did her homework, which is, I think, the message I wanted to deliver to the people here that are still in graduate school. I went to school here, Diana went to school here, Rick went to school here, her husband who's in the back. And besides doing her homework, she was able to translate that to people who had to actually make the decisions. And you've got to be able to do both. And I think that's why she was so successful in her career. And of all the things she could talk about, which are many, we asked her to focus on the Sacramento River for a lot of reasons, and I'll let her explain what those are. So without further ado, Dr. Diana Jacobs.
Wow. Hello? I'm on now? Okay. That pretty much sums it up. I guess that we can all go now. Thank you. That was a great introduction. I want to start, before I get into the Sacramento River, to explain the title of the talk, Tales of the New Fish Patrol, Saving California's Largest River, the Mighty Sacramento. Now, why did I say Tales of the New Fish Patrol? In fact, Tim and I had an argument. Would it be New Tales of the Fish Patrol or Tales of the New Fish Patrol? But I want to say where I got that, and that's from a little book by Jack London that I got from Cousin Howard, who's here. Thank you, Howard. He wrote this collection of short stories, and they're pretty harrowing tales of when he was a young man. He was only in his teens in the late 1800s, sailing around San Francisco Bay. And he was doing the public trust duty at that time. He was catching poachers. He was a deputy patrolman for the Board of Fish Commissioners, which was the predecessor to the Department of Fish and Game. And I thought, well, you know, that's the way it was then. You were out with gunplay and near drownings. That was pretty exciting stuff that's all in this great little book. And nowadays, the new tales of the Fish Patrol are more often what Tim said. You know, you've got to be in the offices doing the budget, and that's been my career. That's the new tales of the Fish Patrol, whether it's facing down vice presidents from the Metropolitan Water District or Westlands Water District, or sweating it under the lights with the legislature, you know, Senator Machado glaring at you and grilling you, or even crashing computer systems when the memory couldn't handle all these maps that I'm going to show you. So that's the new tales. Anyway, that explains the title. So on to the Sacramento River. If California, I always argue with Tim, but since I have the mic, I will say this. If we had a state river in California, it would surely be the Sacramento. It's our largest river, has the most water supply, has the largest floods. It historically had the largest salmon runs, still does have the largest salmon runs. It historically had the largest riparian forest, still has the largest riparian forest. It's the biggest and best river, and yet I find that most Californians really don't know this river at all. It's amazing. So what I'm going to do tonight, at my hour or so, is to give an overview of its geography, some history, and how it's managed and engineered, and some tales along the way. And I do have ulterior motives. Tim mentioned that I've been able to direct, along with Tim himself and other colleagues, direct a lot of funding for research and science on the Sacramento River. And I want to make sure that continues. It is a worthwhile resource. It's one of our most important resources. And certainly good news on Tuesday with Prop 84. There will be, it looks like, more funding available for restoration, but make sure that we continue the science as well. You know, when you go out in Andronico's parking lot or whatever here in Berkeley and you see Save the Whales, Save Lake Tahoe, Save Mona Lake, you never see Save the Sac. And it's just been my passion to get people to really realize what a treasure this is. So here we go, an overview, and kind of like a floodplain, it's going to be a mile wide and an inch deep. Starting with geography. It's a huge watershed. It's our largest river, as I said. It's almost a fifth of the state. It goes all the way to the Oregon border on the Pitt River system. But what I'm going to talk about, can you see the color red on the main stem there? Shasta Lake down to the city of Sacramento. The valley portion, the big portion of the river, is what I'm going to concentrate. I want to point out that's Shasta Lake, and there's Lake Oroville, and Sutter Buttes. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to point that out. It's right in there. Those are landmarks, and then the city of Sacramento, I'll keep referring to them. Oh, there we go. That's much better. There's Sutter Buttes right there. And when we talk about the valley reach, it really has sub-reaches that are quite distinctive. So I'm going to talk about those, take kind of a tour from Shasta down to Sacramento. The upper stretch is from Shasta or Keswick Dam, which is the regulating dam below Shasta, down to Red Bluff is one reach. Red Bluff to Chico Landing down to Colusa, and then down to the mouth of the Feather at Verona in the Sacramento area. Now, also on this map, you can see I-5, you can see Highway 99, and you can see the Sacramento River in between. And I think that's part of the reason that nobody knows about the Sacramento River is those major highways just are, far apart. So you see it when you cross it here and sometimes up here, but it's pretty undiscovered by many. So starting with Shasta, the huge dam at the head of the valley, and then, as I said, below Keswick Dam, I'm going to use those interchangeably. The reach is confined by geology naturally. And here's an exaggerated cross-section where it's just kind of entrenched and confined naturally by the geology. So you have these steep rock walls. And it really meanders it's a sinuous pattern, but it doesn't move. It doesn't move in the sense of a meandering river. It's almost like the Grand Canyon in that sense. This is a wonderful reach. It's got a lot of salmon spawning because the water's cold coming out of Shasta, and it's a great canoeing and rafting reach. Now, as we go down below Red Bluff, you can see Mount Shasta in the distance looking upstream. It flattens out and becomes a big valley, alluvial river proper. And that's where it really is wonderful. This is the exaggerated cross-section again, flat, typical, huge, long floodplain with a channel that kind of moves back and forth. And this is an aerial view showing what I'm talking about. Here's the channel. You can see where it's kind of been. And then also, this meander belt, I want to point out, and you'll hear me talk more, is sort of this area where it returns the ground, but it also floods overbank. So this is an area where the river can be a river from Red Bluff down to Chico Landing, and it still is. And you just can't describe how wonderful it is. I mean, it's just teeming with wildlife, and the abundance is just amazing. And as you move down, though, we start picking up levees. This is a winter shot, so it doesn't look as green, but it's still as lush. This is a levee on one side of the river. This is where we have some setback levees in sort of the middle reaches. And it can kind of meander, but it is constrained in a little ways. And in moving downstream, again, here's the Sutter Buttes. The levees get closer and closer together. And then you have farmland, which is kind of low land. It's interesting. And if you look in cross-section, the river down here was a very different river than upstream where it was meandering. It actually built high ground nearby, natural levees, and then low ground off to the distant sides where you had tule marshes. People, when they built flood control system, put the artificial levees on top of the natural levees. So that's kind of, again, exaggerated. But whereas in the Sacramento River above it, it sloped gently down. You have some high ground near and then lower ground off to the side. So what it looks like down below Colusa is getting to be a very narrow channel, artificial levees, not much vegetation, and finally becomes a really urban river, where a lot of people know it as in Sacramento. Flip a few pages before I continue. When it hits Sacramento, it's really at the upper end of the delta. And I know other speakers have talked about this, so I won't really go into it very much. In fact, Ray Seed, I think, talked about delta levees and what that means. I'll just repeat that there's a lot of fresh water coming down the system from the Sacramento main stem, the Feather, and the American, part of the state and federal water projects. The state and federal water project pumps are in the South Delta, and there are no pipelines to get the water from here to here. It just kind of goes through the maze of delta channels that there are levees on. So the levee security is a hugely important issue for water security. But meanwhile, the Sacramento River will mostly go out the bay and connect with the ocean. So that's sort of the overview of the geography. I want to go into the biota now, starting with the fish. Sacramento has a pretty diverse fish fauna, a lot of anadromous species and dozens of native species, but unfortunately dozens of non-native species, and we even have one extinct species on the Sac system. But what I really want to spend some time is about the Chinook or king salmon. Sacramento is unique in having 4 different runs of the Chinook salmon, and they're named winter, spring, fall, late fall for the time they come through the Golden Gate, which is kind of cool. This winter run and spring run are listed species. The winter run is an endangered species. Spring run is a threatened species. The fall and late fall are commercially fished. In fact, the fall run Chinook salmon or king salmon from the Sacramento River is the single most important stock of Chinook caught off the 3 coastal states of Sacramento, of California, Oregon, and Washington. So it's pretty nifty. Sacramento is important to the other coastal states too. The winter and spring run come in those time periods, and they also spawn in the fall. So those adult fish, when they come into the system, have to find some cold pools to hang around all summer long until spawning season. That's one reason why they're endangered. The winter run used to go way up into the pit in the McCloud where there are cool pools, but Shasta cut that off. They now spawn only in the main stem below Keswick or Shasta Dam. The spring run are limited only to a few tributary creeks like Butte Creek near Chico. So it's a pretty tricky issue how we manage these endangered runs. This is just a depiction of the historic distribution. The reds are all the big dams we have now that block off the historic spawning. And we've lost about 1/2 of the spawning grounds we used to have. Fish do still spawn in all these streams and rivers. The big ones are the Feather River, the American River, and of course the main stem, Sacramento. So the fall run are still in the river spawning, but we also have, and I don't know if the video will pick it up, but I'm quoting, mitigation hatcheries. We have to mitigate for the loss of the spawning habitat, the Feather, the Shasta, and the American. There are hatcheries to produce mostly fall run as well. The fall run kind of mixed together in the ocean, and when you get one at the store, you really don't know whether you're getting necessarily a hatchery one or a river spawned one, and they do mix up quite a bit. The genetics are kind of messed up at this point. This is just one of the spring run system. This is Mill Creek in Tehama County, runs out of Mount Lassen area. And this is Butte Creek that I spoke about. That this dark stuff in here is probably about a couple of thousand winter or spring run salmon that are just milling around all summer long. It's pretty amazing to hike into this place. Tim and I have done it a couple of times. And it's, it's all private or PG&E, and it's a tough hike, but when you get there, you're rewarded by seeing the most extraordinary sight of these giant fish, 3 feet long, just milling around, and it's 100 degrees outside because you're in the valley, and yet that water is cold enough to sustain them over the summer. On to what I actually started out life as, a plant ecologist, the riparian habitat. And associated wildlife. Whoops. I got it, but you don't. There we go. That is a bald eagle. And my husband Rick took this picture. It's an immature, so he doesn't have a whitehead this summer on the Sac River. It's a pretty neat place. The cottonwood-dominated riparian habitat on the Sac River is, like I've said, is like nothing I've ever seen anywhere else in the state. I've always thought it kind of looked like what a tropical rainforest would be. I've never been to the Amazon or the tropical rainforest, but my niece has, and she assures me, yes, Auntie Di, it does look like that down there. So it's amazing habitat stuff. How do we get this habitat? I need to give a kind of a real brief overview, simplification of some river processes. This is a cartoon depiction of kind of a typical meandering loop on an alluvial river where we have eroding on these cut bars or cut banks, and then depositing on the opposite side a point bar. And this loop will move in space so that the channel will move this way and downstream. And so the channel on a natural river without confinement is going to move all the time. That helps the plants by creating environments that the seedlings of cottonwoods can come establish. So here's another cartoon of the cutting bank on this side is establishing cottonwoods, and then in like 10 or 20 years, as the river cuts that way, those cottonwoods that were here are now going to grow up into teenage trees and eventually into mature trees as the river migrates. So it has to move in order to regenerate this kind of forest. If you have a high bank, cottonwoods cannot, seedlings cannot come established. They have to be down here where it's moist by the river. So here's a cut bank of the Sacramento River. In fact, I did want to show you another species that likes cut banks. There's little holes in this. I don't know if you guys can see that. That's a bank swallow colony. Bank swallow colony. That's a threatened bird species that is found pretty much only on the eroding banks of the Sacramento River. So on one side you'll have a cut bank. This could be 20 to 30 feet high. On the other side you have a point bar that's new deposited moist gravel or sand, and you have cottonwood and willow seedlings. From the air, and this is a winter shot again, you'll see what happens over time is it looks like rows are actually planted as this bar is moving this direction. These are the old trees that were laid down, decades ago, and then younger ones and younger ones and younger ones, and that's just how the system works. So you can even see the tracings from the air. And from a boat, you can see the different size, young, medium, teenage, middle-age, old, as you look back into the distance. But that's just really oversimplified. Over time, the river can cut off meander loops, make old oxbow lakes, abandoned channels. Other species can come in. So you really get a very complicated system of other habitats like this old slough and stuff like that. It's just amazing now what species can be supported, especially bird life. Just spectacular. The riparian forest is also good for the aquatic system, primarily for the structure it provides and also the food. And you can see a lot of the erosion creating woody debris. To a river engineer, those are snags, but to a fish biologist, that's habitat. Also provides shade and other structure for the juvenile fish as they're migrating down. Well, it is a wonderful ecosystem, and that's what you see on the middle parts of the Sacramento River. And this isn't history, this is what you see now. But it all depends on a river being a river, a lot of action, a lot of flooding, a lot of erosion, a lot of migration over the space. And that variability and, flood times, drought times is what creates it and makes it so diverse. Too bad people don't like it that way. They like it to be, a static, predictable system. So, in fact, over this natural system, the geography I showed you, we have two kinds of plumbing systems in the Sacramento River. We have a flood control system, it's huge, and a water supply system. So here's a quick overview of those two systems. The flood control system is a state and federal system. Again, starting from Shasta down to Sacramento. Everything in red is what the Corps of Engineers designed and built for the flood control system. So it's a huge amount of plumbing on this river. Also, the upstream reservoirs are operated partly for water supply and partly for flood control. So that's part of the system as well. So I want to kind of explain how it works. It's really nifty. Up here is the confined reach. So we have Shasta and we have flows up here, but there's, that's about all that's going on. In the unconfined reach, there's no levees in here. And it's not until you get Chico Landing that you get the major flood control system. You have levees on one side of the river all the way down. And then levees, no levees on this side because water is supposed to split. The floodwaters coming down, split into the Butte Basin and overflow, gather and come around the Sutter Buttes and join a Sutter bypass, and eventually cross the Sacramento River and end up in the Yolo bypass. So what happens is you have a lot of water coming down, splits, and so less and less water is coming down the main channel, and more water is going into these overflow basins. So by the time, when you're up here, you got about maybe 250,000 cubic feet per second, 250 CFS, and it's all in the river channel and in nearby floodplain. But when you get down here, the river has only 100 CFS, 100,000 CFS, and there's 500,000 CFS. So 5 times is in the bypasses in the main channel. So it's pretty nifty how it really mimics the old system of, this is what the river used to do. It used to jump its banks and come over and flood these great sinks of tule marshes, as I mentioned before, and that's how the river got designed. It was almost not designed that way, and there's a great history book called Battling the Inland Sea that recounts the history of the flood control, and how did they wrestle and end up with the bypass system instead of a real narrow, poorly designed, inadequate system. How does this jive, again, with the natural system? Here's the Sutter Buttes. The green, this is from Steve Greco's dissertation, I need to credit. The green is probably the historic extent of natural levees and riparian habitat. And you can see it was wide up here and then narrows down, and we had these big basins of swampland. And today, the system kind of uses those historic lowlands. This is an area where it's still flooded, the Butte Basin, an area of wetland and rice fields. This is the Sutter bypass, which is in the Sutter Basin, and the Yolo bypass is in the Yolo Basin. The Colusa Basin over here isn't part of the flood control sector, but it's still used for rice fields, and it's actually kind of close to what it was. The unfortunate thing, I suppose, about this picture is this is the American Basin and near the American River, and this is all going to be houses halfway there already, so that's going to be trouble. This is just a picture of what I was talking about. The channel is here, but in high water, it just floods over its floodplain, and this is looking downstream. All this water is headed down over bank into the Butte Sink, and this happens today, as I said. It's pretty amazing. Okay, plumbing system number 2. These are the big water supply projects, and I guess we could find the San Francisco PUC right there, huh? But basically, the big dogs are the state and federal projects, which, as I mentioned, have delta channels and canals that deliver water to the San Joaquin Valley in Southern California. And here's where I use my line, how important is the Sacramento River? It determines the fate of the free world, and this is how. Because the Sacramento River is the most important water for the state of California. And water determines the fate of the state of California. California determines the state of the United States, and California and the United States determines the fate of the free world. So that's why the Sacramento River is really important. So, plumbing. Here are the big plumbing systems. This is, believe it or not, I don't know if everybody knows. The Trinity River is dammed. This is way over on the other side of the mountains, and that water is pumped over into the Sacramento River. That's part of this federal Central Valley Project. Even though it's called the Central Valley Project, they have been for years taking water out of the Trinity system. The good news is that that's being restored, physical stuff, and a lot more water is being left in the river and doing proper flows to maintain the geomorphology and the fish on the Trinity. So there's good news there. So, but less water for the Sacramento. But it never was there naturally anyway. But anyway, the Shasta is part of the federal system, as well as the American, and the state system is Lake Oroville. And as I mentioned before, all of these are managed for Delta exports down here, basically. Now, a water resources engineer that I've worked with over the years, they often can reduce these great rivers that I've shown pictures of to kind of a wiring diagram. And the good news is they do operate together, and they try to work cooperatively, the state and federal systems. But the bad news, I guess, for someone interested in fish preservation is they do work together, and they're always on the edge of maximizing delta diversions. Now, here's one of my tales. This chart, this is an actual printout of a chart that I was showed when I first started working. I'd been working on all kinds of things, like Tim mentioned, but in 2001, I was thrown into a meeting on water operations in the Delta, and I had never been to one of these meetings before, and there were a bunch of biologists and engineers sitting around looking at these kind of charts. And this was the Sacramento River system and the other plumbing, and I didn't even know whether to laugh or to cry. I couldn't believe that, this river that I'd been working on in riparian habitat had been reduced to these charts. The amazing thing is that after about 5 years, I kind of got used to it and jazzed about it, and fighting with the water contractors and everything became my way of life too. But it's pretty weird to step back every once in a while and say, is this really our river? But there it is. Well, who are these people who go to the meetings and figure out how to turn the dials and all that? I just want to give you an idea of the river managers, who's in charge. On the water supply end, the big dogs are the Department of Water Resources and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. The flood management system, that big plumbing system, is the State Reclamation Board and the Department of Water Resources and the Corps of Engineers on the federal side. Habitat is managed by my old department, Fish and Game. Also, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a lot of land. And I don't want to understate, a lot of private landowners are really good stewards. And there's a lot of riparian habitat right now in Meandering River that's still in private ownership. And non-government organizations like the Nature Conservancy are very active. So these are sort of the managers. There are regulators. Water rights and water quality, the usual cast of characters, State Water Board, the Regional Water Board, US EPA. One that not everybody might be familiar with is a lot of these dams generate power and are subject to another federal agency, the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And then last but not least, the permitting side, especially endangered state and federal endangered species acts, which I spent a lot of time in recent years on. Fish and Wildlife, Department of Fish and Game, and National Marine Fisheries Service. And also the Corps of Engineers has regulatory power as well. As you can imagine, it's tough getting everybody on the same page, and we all have somewhat competing interests. And I guess that's what my career has been, finding a balance with all these competing demands. But there are a lot of horror stories in the environment, but I find that the Sacramento River is really not one of those bad things. It's I have a lot of reason for optimism on this river. So I want to tell you why I have optimism, and it's a bit of a longer tale. And I call my tale the M word, which I'll explain. So just some history. The flood control system was built in, I don't know, the 1900s and 19-teens. And as I said, it went up to the Chico Landing area. That's where the levee stopped. However, in 1958, the Corps of Engineers decided that Meandering Reach had a lot of bank erosion going on in it. A typical scene would have looked like that. And they decided they got authorized to put rock riprap on places like that. Even though there were no levees and it wasn't part of the real flood control system, they did get authorized to put riprap, and they started riprapping that upper meandering stretch of the river. And I kind of came into it in the early 80s. Oh. I will introduce. Thank you. But the Corps kept continuing, and in 1975, this is finally, there are some environmental laws. This is a final EIS, this thick, to riprap. If you can see the pink, from Chico Landing to Red Bluff, pretty much every outside bend. And, you know, wow. But instead of being able to do that, something else was going on in that time period. And I have a copy of this. This is the very first Riparian Habitat Conference. The proceedings were ½ an inch thick. And any of you who know Riparian Habitat Conferences nowadays, they're 3 inches thick. And, you know, we have a stack of them this long. This is the first. This is the conference is in 1977 as well. Also, fish were sort of starting to decline. The fall run, the primary, we had some big years in the 50s, and then we started having some low years, and it wasn't having huge years anymore, just sort of damped down and low. The winter run especially was crashing with, you know, way down to a couple of thousand and even hundreds out here. But in that time period, a couple of thousand from tens of thousands. So, times changed for the Corps, and we started having a lot of conflict and discussions in their public policy arena. This is the era where, in the early 80s, the Sacramento River Preservation Trust was formed. There were lots of litigation was threatened over this rock riprap and you know, the potential project of the Corps to riprap and stabilize. I mean, their stated goal was to stabilize the river channel from Chico Landing to Red Bluff. They had a public policy idea, which they said was to prevent downstream sedimentation of the flood control project. But in truth, if you look at Robert Kelly's book and the Corps flood control project was actually designed to scour sediment. It was not, it doesn't clog up the sediment at all. In fact, it's a scouring system. So this reason for them to riprap the erosion upstream was, you know, I guess you would have to say bogus, and I can say that now because I'm retired. It feels good to be able to do that. Anyway, there was an awful lot of fighting in the early 80s then over this notion. Well, back in the 80s, we actually had a government that governed, and there was a legislative solution. Did I blow the mic against? Yeah. Maybe I should just hold the other one. Yeah. Put it somewhere else.
Hello.
So anyway, there was a legislation, and this was a bill called SB 1086, Senate Bill 1086. It was bipartisan, even though the ultimate author was a Republican, Jim Nielsen, who's still around in the Woodland area. It launched an effort to restore the natural resources of the river, and it's still around today, basically. What the bill did was call for a couple of things. One was an easy part, just an inventory of willing sellers in riparian habitat. But it also then said we want to plan. We want to plan to restore fisheries and riparian habitat of the Sacramento River. And I guess, you know, the thinking was if you could restore the environment, then, you know, the farmers could have whatever they wanted. I really have a feeling that the authors and legislature didn't quite realize what they were getting into, thinking that if you protect riparian habitat, we could do our rock. They didn't realize, you know, that wouldn't work that way. But needless to say, it did set off a process which became really important. About 25 agencies and interest groups were convened to work on this plan. I joined this as, you know, I was a real junior biologist at the time, to come to a lot of these meetings. They were in little county courthouses and supervisors' buildings up and down the valley. Got to see a lot of interesting little towns. So most of those river agencies that I mentioned on the previous blue slides, and then a lot of stakeholders like farmers, people interested in flood control, were invited to convene on these and come up with a plan. We also had field trips. You know, we really did a lot of talking. And the amazing thing was, in those days, we really didn't know about environmental mediation and meeting facilitation. The original chair was a guy named Bob Bosworth. He was a county supervisor from Shasta County, and a rancher. And he just decided, I don't know how, that we would make decisions by consensus, you know, all on his own. And so having these 25, you know, cats to herd and different divergent views was pretty amazing. And he didn't have any training in this. It took a long time, a lot of shouting, I'm sure, and we wasted some time. But nonetheless, we got there. And in the 2 years that we had allotted, we did come up with a plan to restore fisheries and riparian habitat on the Sac. Now this one I have a picture of too, or I brought. It's not much thicker. So all this huge, complicated river, you know, we thought we were pretty smart, and this is all it took, this little document. I look at it now and think of all the volumes that we've studied and written on it. I'm a little bit embarrassed, but, and it was very thin on the science, but I think we had a good notion of the conceptual models we were working on, and it was a consensus document, and because of that, it did have a lot of political clout, especially on the fish side. The fish problems back in 1989 when we did that plan were pretty easy to see. There were some big old bad dams, tributary dams that didn't have ladders. There was a toxic mine called Iron Mountain Mine dumping out just horrible toxic and acid water into the Sacramento River. We often call it no-brainers. There were 20 issues that people could agree on at the end of the day for fish. And so there was consensus on those. And because there was consensus, as I mentioned, that had a lot of political clout. So in Washington wanted to know what SB 1086 thought. And they embraced it. In fact, when the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, CVPIA, was passed, and CalFed later, all those programs took up these same 20 items and have been funding it ever since. And so a lot of work has been accomplished for fisheries protection and restoration. This is a picture of Bruce Babbitt on Butte Creek with the ceremonial first sledgehammer. Picture of Secretary for Resources, Mary Nichols, doing the ceremonial first bucketful of the concrete seltzer dam on Clear Creek. As you can see, I learned the value of a press event, too, on these deals. And another project that was kind of a no-brainer is below Keswick and Shasta. The water is cold, but fish need gravel, spawning gravel also, and because of the dams, there's not an infusion of gravel like a natural river would have, so we have to dump gravel into it. So that's been done and funded. Again, a no-brainer. There's actually a dam across the river at Red Bluff, the Red Bluff Diversion Dam. Happily, the gates can move up and down. It used to be these gates were down a lot of the year and damming it up, but now they're up most of the year. So a lot of things, as I said, were done because people agreed on them, and they were easy, relatively speaking. Well, what about the riparian habitat issue? That turned out to be not so easy. As I said, the riparian habitat depends on the river moving, which is the meandering across its floodplain. That's a lot of landscape to cover in the valley. And it's kind of a scary proposition when you have people who live and farm along the river. In fact, you know, when we started meeting, we used to all the biologists in the room had this notion that, yeah, you need the river to meander. But the farmers, they had another idea. To them, they didn't see this as a point bar and cut bank erosion, natural process. They saw that as, you know, as erosion. They're losing their farms, they're losing their houses. So basically, they didn't want to talk about meander, and we literally did call it the M word. We called it the M word for 18 months of our 2-year time frame. But by gosh, after a lot of talking and a lot of maps and a lot of photos, we finally kind of convinced people that if you want to have riparian habitat, You have to let the river be a river. And one thing that we did impart in kind of educating ourselves is that the meander zone is a lot narrower than the floodplain. So again, there are a lot of people who had fear that, wow, we're going to buy up, you know, hundreds of thousands of acres of the valley, and that's not so. It doesn't have to be. So it turns out also that the river, the lands right along the river that are flooded most often by overbank flow are also the part that's in the active meander zone. So there are a lot of willing sellers who really were happy to get bought out and move off the river. So it really was a wonderful win-win situation. Even the Corps realized that resistance was futile. This is rock that they put in the original old Chico Lending to Red Bluff project, and the river just ignored it and, you know, didn't stop the river at all. The good news was they didn't get enough done to stop the river, and so there are some remnants out in the river that you can see. We had a lot of agreement too on a limited meander concept where if we could protect things like towns and bridges and stuff and have just enough room, you know, maybe not everybody would want to sell, and it would be, you know, kind of a tenuous agreement was worked out to do this. Now, you know, that was the concept, and it was a very thin book, and we kept working on it because it was pretty hard to decide how is it going to work out, and is there going to be a new layer of government, a new river conservancy, or what have you. And all along the way, there have been bond acts, and habitat has been acquired, and the original SB 1086 Advisory Council has changed into a new local nonprofit called the Sacramento River Conservation Area Forum. And there's a new handbook. It's a thicker document. We're getting much more robust. And every year, the SRCAF has its annual beef and fish barbecue where we sit down together and make nice. But we have meetings all the time. And so the whole spirit of consensus, even though we have maybe different perspectives on farming and habitat and fish, that still goes on today, even 20 years later. So here's the website where you will find all these documents on the top, and a copy of the handbook and a lot of river atlases. So it's a pretty useful site. Well, I act like it's a rosy picture, but is it really? Now, in 1977, the first conference, they estimated there was about 12,000 acres of riparian habitat left along the river. And today, we're getting back to 1950s numbers, basically in the 20 to 25,000 acres. So it is pretty good news. There's been a lot of acquisition of land that's just in existing habitat. And land that was farmed and then cleared and has been restored as well. At the same time, you know, even though we thought we knew what we were doing, we really didn't have a lot of the science. How wide should the meander belt be and how many years and all that? Our conceptual model was that if we had enough room for the river to kind of go through a whole life cycle on about 100 years of a cottonwood, just so happened to be cottonwoods live around 100 years, then we would have enough to maintain this cottonwood-dominated forest. So these trees probably are, you know, 70 to 100 years old. And so that was our conceptual model. We didn't really have the computing horsepower or the GIS system. We had a lot of hand-drawn maps. But as time has gone on, there have been a lot of researchers and a lot of good science that has kind of backed this up, and it's really great to see the science behind this meander belt concept coming out and, you know, putting a lot of meat on the bones. I know that Steve Greco and Eric Larson at UC Davis, people here, John Stella had, I think, just finished some graduate work. Renata is working around here. Matt Kondoff works on the river. There's a lot of folks doing research. And here's part of my pitch, is that the CalFed program did a lot of funding of restoration, but it also required good science along with the restoration. So I hope that as we go forward with new bond acts that we can maintain that commitment to science to make sure we are doing the right thing, because one of the best things I got to do in the later years of my career is basically, yeah, it was fun to sit down in meetings and talk about these conceptual things, but to really to know it and understand it and make sure that the good science is being done so that you do get it right. Because this river is huge, and you could make a mistake. But we do have a lot of riparian habitat protected, and now people can visit it. There's a new Sacramento River National Wildlife Refuge. There's a river refuge, not just the waterfowl refuge that's also named the Sacramento River. And the Fish and Game has a Sacramento River wildlife area. It's about 15,000 acres of public land now along the Sacramento River with a lot more public access points. So that's a lot of good news. How are the fish doing? Well, they're doing better too. I showed you kind of a truncated version of this graph where I said there was getting worrisome back in here. But in the recent years, and 2005 is our most one, we've got, this year was about 2003, over 800,000 spawning fish returned to the Sacramento River. I mean, that is way over what we had in the 50s. So there's been a huge rebound. This is a little bit worrisome here, this downward trend. But last year we had a little uptick. I don't know what we're doing this year. I know Rick and I have been trying to fish for them all fall, and we've caught nothing. So I hope they're late and not just not coming. But it is pretty rosy for the Sacramento River. This, again, is our commercial run. The winter run, one of the endangered runs, is also coming uptick. Some of these years, I kid you not, they counted like less than 200 fish returned. So coming back up to 10 or 15,000 is just an amazing achievement. Hopefully that will continue to uptick. However, even though I said it is rosy, it is optimistic, but I have some worries. And the worries I have are partly about the flood control system and what's been going on kind of post-Katrina and the panic about levees and all that you hear. Department of Water Resources and the Corps recently this summer announced they've done some emergency levee repair sites, and these are the sites. I don't know if you can see them all. Again, here's the Sutter Buttes for where location Sacramento. So this is that lower section of the flood control part where they had decided there were some critical erosion sites, and they didn't wait even for the Bond Act, which did pass last Tuesday, and went ahead and rip-rapped. So you think, well, this is a great idea. We're going to have, more secure levees. But was it a good idea? Well, this is a map of the same area of the flood control system done by the Corps of Engineers for a study they did a couple of years ago. The stuff in red are what they judged to have not enough capacity to carry the water that was designed in these floods. So everything you see in red has got a channel that's too small to carry the designated flood. So what are they doing? They're repairing the levees, but there's not enough capacity. So, are we really safer, or is it just kind of a Band-Aid? Another thing that's happening is that in California, local cities and counties get to decide who builds. Those ones with permit jurisdiction, and that includes if you're going to build behind a levee. So here's the Yuba City levee, and we're still allowing development on the floodplain. The lessons, I mean, this is, even though Katrina happened last year, this is nothing new. People know that levees break, and building in a floodplain is not a great idea. This is all knowable stuff. And in fact, in the state, there is an oversight agency that can look at these issues in the Central Valley, and that's the State Reclamation Board. Now, under Gray Davis, there was an interesting board selected. included the head of the Sac River Conservation Area Forum, my friend and Tehama County Republican, Bert Bundy. It included Jeff Mount, Professor Flood from UC Davis, included Betsy Marchand, a Yolo County supervisor, a real mix of people, but they were all civic-minded. It was amazing, and they started cracking down on approving projects, you know, with using their oversight clout of projects in the floodplain. However, and Governor Schwarzenegger left them for a while, but last year he replaced the whole board with a new board. And if you've been following the newspapers, they've been starting to allow more and more development in the floodplain. So. Even though I'm retired, I guess, you know, I will say this has been certainly a disappointment from the governor. But since I'm an optimist, there are still some good projects happening, and we do have a couple of bond acts that are potential. This is a section of the Sacramento River upstream in Tehama County. This is Glenn County. This is Hamilton City. Now, it's called Hamilton City. I don't even think it's incorporated. It's really a tiny, tiny little community. Very poor, could never qualify for flood control, but yet they're subjected to flows coming around, overbank flow on the Sacramento River. But with the Sacramento River Conservation Area Forum and Bert, years of thinking about this little town and why can't it get flood control because they can't afford it, is that if you could set back the levee and have this restored into habitat, you could have an ecosystem restoration project and a flood control project at the same time. And it's still chugging along. The Corps of Engineers is actually, you know, working on it. The Department of Water Resources, the Nature Conservancy has worked on it. So it's good news, and it's a small one, and, you know, you should probably try to pay attention to it. It will be a model, hopefully, for spending some of the levy bond money and the Prop 84 money that the voters passed last Tuesday. So it's, you know, there's some reason for hope on this flood control thing, but there's an awful lot of, you know, hysteria about we got to fix the levees, but, you know, maybe we ought to rethink the whole floodplain management situation. I want to wrap it up. Back to fish for a second. My background is plant ecology, but I've learned that, you know, there's nothing like Pacific salmon as a public trust resource. It really mobilizes people. It's an economic resource. It's a wonderful food. It really can capture the imagination, and I want to end thinking about the salmon. So a whole salmon in the market, $25 a pound. Shasta Dam temperature device, $80 million. Fixing the toxic Iron Mountain mine near Redding, draining into it, $950 million. And me swimming with the endangered Butte Creek Spring Run in 58-degree water without a wetsuit, priceless.
I'm going to MC questions. We have time. We have time for questions. Oh, and you have to repeat the question with the microphone.
I've heard that story many times about having Schwarzenegger sack the board, the reclamation board, and I initially, I guess, you know, thought that it was also similarly bad. But do you know any idea what was going through, what's in the background of his decision? If it was his decision or for someone else's?
No, I don't. No, I don't, but, you know, I'd almost ask Tim to speculate. I'll speculate a little since I am retired. Some of the people he put on were very conservative farmers from Colusa County. You know, thinking ahead when he made the appointments, was he thinking, you know, I've got the environmental movement, I need the conservative, I need to make sure I have the conservative votes for when re-election happens. I don't know. Do you want to add any? Sure you do. You're not retired, but be careful.
I might want a job again with the state someday. I'll just add that there are 7 people on the board. They're pleasure appointments. There's no terms. There's no qualifications for them at all. And I think some of the folks who were also appointed by the governor who work on water tried really hard to make sure that if the governor was going to change the board, that they kept some of them or tried to go in the direction things were going. It's not clear to me why things were done the way that they were. I don't know that the governor was, intimately involved in those details and discussions. There are countless people that are appointed by the governor. I'm sure he was briefed at some point in time, but I think they probably instantly regretted as big a change as they made because they tried really hard to, and they're still trying hard, I think, to recover in some ways because we were going, I think, in a pretty good direction, and even people in the valley that worked on this for 20, 25 years were a little surprised about the direction they went in, which is too bad. But there was also a bill put forward to try to change the membership of the board so that they had terms and qualifications, which I don't remember if it passed or not.
No.
So, time for another legislative session.
Yeah. Let me just add that in the governor's defense, this governor, the Department of Water Resources that handles flood control for the state has been doing pretty good things. They're being rational as much as they can be. It's this call for, it's kind of like, it reminds me of the 50s though, it's like we got an erosion site, we need to immediately, shore it up rather than rethink the whole system. So, probably there's needs for Band-Aids sometimes and immediate relief, but I feel that the people I know who are in the Department of Water Resources now, want to do some different things with floodplain management. It's just that the valley people are kind of not there, but I think the professionals and the administration people are trying.
I think all people need to repeat the question.
Oh.
What do you think about the idea of a peripheral canal?
What do I think about the idea of a peripheral canal? I run hot and cold on that. Our water here, this is from my tap in Berkeley, comes out of a peripheral canal. It comes from the McCollum River watershed. Tim, my colleague and buddy, operates a peripheral canal, the Hetch Hetchy system. So, it probably would be a lot more efficient if I were in charge, of course, of making sure you don't take too much water, but it would be a lot more efficient to get the fresh water from Sacramento down to water drinkers in the south with a similar system. You wouldn't have the delta mess to contend with. That was the sort of the environmental pitch. Now with Katrina and global warming, I guess I would have to say we better start building it yesterday because people are going to be in a world of hurt with global climate change and the sea level rise. I don't think we can sustain the freshwater system we have. So it doesn't even matter what I think. I think it's there. I'll even be bolder.
Yeah, you didn't mention water quality issues all that much. What are some of the outstanding water quality issues in the Sacramento River Basin where we need more science?
The question is about water quality, and I didn't mention water quality in the Sacramento Basin and what are some of the outstanding issues and that we need research on. I'm not going to be much help on that. As you can tell, that wasn't my thing, but I also do want to say that the Sacramento River water quality is good. The USGS has done a study and an overview, and in general, it's pretty good, and that's why it's so precious, and that's why getting it through the delta and into the South Delta pumps is the big deal. It is great water quality. The big one, I think, is solved, which was the Iron Mountain mine way up north, which was an old heavy metals mine. I don't even know what they mined, copper or something, that put incredibly acidic water and heavy metals into the river. Other than that, I think there's, the local sewage, things like that. It isn't as unsolvable an issue as some of the other ones, like flood control. Michael?
Given this climate change, has that changed your ideas about ecological restoration and kinds of habitat that should be saved or whatever? Where do people fit in, and do you have any ideas for how to solve that in an intelligent way?
Okay, 3 more hours. The question refers to, I'll just summarize it, does global climate change anything about restoration on river systems? You know, I guess I will say this, the river is got a lot of natural processes going on now. It has flooding, it has meander, but it also has, it is an artificial system. Shasta profoundly changed it. The hydrograph is very different. They tend to shave off flood peaks and increase summer flows. And also there's a change in sediment balance, but yet things kind of on the river, you know, equalize out, and there's something there that is a natural system. So it's almost if you can set a river up. This is not for every kind of habitat, but you know, I think things will kind of, it's already coming to a new equilibrium with Shasta there, and it's still pretty neat. So because I'm just an incurable optimist, I'll, you know, hope that, you know, if you have enough room for the river processes to happen, it will kind of, you know, come to a new equilibrium.
Do you have any thoughts about how off-stream storage downstream of Shasta might or might not play in the future on site?
The question is about the potential role of off-stream storage for managing the Sacramento River. The stuff that I've seen, there's a proposal to have a new reservoir in a very confusing name. It's a site called Sites. I don't know where they came up with that, but it took me quite a long, it's a town, a little tiny settlement called Sites. And there's a proposal to make an off-stream reservoir. You'd pump Sacramento River water, store it, and use it to kind of soften some of the management problems you have regulating and getting delta water. I never met a dam I liked, so I'm very, you know, nervous about that, because how are you sure that it's going to be used for good? Because it probably could maybe mitigate for some of the past problems we have of the system we have. But on the other hand, who's going to manage it and who's in charge, and are they going to not manage on the edge to just get more water exported through the delta? So, you know, I'm kind of very nervous about those things, because I think if you build new plumbing, we will use it. Dinner time. Oh, one more.
Given what's happened to the delta, I know you've been doing a lot on the river, but what's happened to the delta the last several years, if you were queen of the world and making a policy recommendation to the esteemed Department of Water Resources on what to do in the delta, aside from the potential for an environmentally sensitive peripheral canal, what would you suggest to Department of Water Resources? What should we do in the next 5 years?
Well, the question is, digest my recent career in 5 minutes. Thanks. Given the state of the delta, even though this is about the Sacramento River, given the state of the delta, the fish are crashing, and we've got global climate change coming, and a real precarious levee situation. If I were queen, what would I say? And I think you have to make some tough calls, and I think you're going to have to sacrifice areas you can't defend. Not necessarily sacrifice them, but just say we can't defend them, and you're going to have to look at you know, the delta, and I know the new studies are coming out on the delta risk management and the levee security, et cetera. And here's the way I kind of summarize it, is that if all the levees go in the delta, or a lot of them suddenly, or even, you know, slowly over a few years, the ecosystem will have a big change, and it will be a damn shame, and it will be a different ecosystem, but it will be a damn shame. But if those levees go for the water supply system, it will be a catastrophe. I mean, that's the difference. And, you know, there will be a change in the fish. They'll, you know, who knows what kind of stuff we'll have. You know, it's all become a striped bass catfish environment. I don't know. There will be fish there. There will be birds there. There will be plants there. It will be very different. But the water supply issue is, oh my gosh. And I'm glad my water is coming from the McCullough. However, I'm a little worried about its own security and the pipe that I get it from. Oh, Linda.
Okay. When you talked about the fisheries and you showed the charts about the different runs of the salmon, and it was really bottomed out, and then now it looks hopeful. So, what do you account for that? For both, like when it bottomed out and then also starting to come up? I mean, probably restoration, but...
Right, yeah, the question is about the salmon cycles. You know, I'll change the question around. You know, do humans get all the credit? You know, credit for crashing them, and then the blame for crashing and the credit for improving them? No, not entirely. You've got not only the weather that happens, you have the ocean conditions. That's a huge thing that I haven't even talked about. And, you know, people study salmon cycles. There's, you know, with the Pacific decadal oscillation or whatever it's called, up and down, you know, El Nino, La Nina cycles in the ocean affect the forage fish. That's being changed. But that cycles, and then the rainfall cycles, and then all the stuff we've done. We keep changing river operations, and we keep changing how much water we divert and where the floods go. But meanwhile, we are opening up some of the spawning ground that we closed off in the era of the big dams in the 40s and 50s. So we're breaking down dams. So there's been some restoration. There's also been a huge amount of investment in fish screens along the river that were taking a lot of fish. That were kind of no-brainers, and we've curtailed a lot of harvest for the endangered runs. So there's been a whole lot of stuff that we've done, you know, pros and cons, and I want to take, you know, I can do a press event and take credit for it all, but you're right, to be fair, you wouldn't.
You're running the whole show, so sure, absolutely.
So it's a little, but outside of the Sacramento, you know, we've been reading in the paper about the crash of the fisheries in the Delta. You want to comment?
The question is about, unlike the salmon, which have been going up, a lot of the native fishes in the Delta have crashed. And by gosh, we don't know why. And, you know, that's still new stuff. And, you know, the delta pumps, those huge delta pumps in the south, change stuff. They change the food dynamics. They change the salinity dynamics. We operate the upstream reservoirs to meet the demands of the pumps. Is that it? They take fish. Is that it? You know, it's been over the last few years, and we all know this. We've been working in some of those meetings. The pumps are to blame. No, the pumps have nothing to do with it. The pumps are to blame. No, the pumps have nothing. I think the latest is the pumps are to blame. Even, you know, it goes back and forth, but the jury is still out on that.